After leaving military service, I really needed a job, a stable one. Sure, I had a pension, but calling it sufficient would be a stretch. At first I took on security guard positions at various places, but none of them satisfied me. The shifts and monotony quickly got under my skin. I was used to a different rhythm, the desert wind, the sound of radio chatter in my earpiece, the tense anticipation. And here, hours marched by in an orderly line. Working in a warehouse seemed like it might suit me. No people, no distractions, just me and the inventory. But no. Boredom devoured me alive. So I started changing jobs as often as gloves, until one day I stumbled upon a strange job posting. The pay was insane, which immediately made it clear that something was fishy. The requirements read as if they were written specifically for me. A former soldier. No criminal record, in good physical shape, and unattached to a family. The job was shift-based. After reading it, I didn't hesitate and dialed the listed number. A pleasant female voice answered, scheduled me for an interview, and set the meeting for the next day at 9 a.m. Even then, I started to feel uneasy. The office was on the outskirts of the city, in a district where decent people wouldn't venture after dark. Old warehouse buildings, crumbling hangars, a desolate road where maybe 1 out of 10 streetlights worked. When I arrived, the morning was still gray, the air heavy with pre-dawn fog. The building looked grim, a simple box with no hint of signage, yet several cars were already parked in front of it. Inside was far more organized than I expected. A small lobby with a minimalist design. A row of plastic chairs lined the wall. Sitting in them were men like me, fit, with hardened gazes and silent patience. I realized there would be competition, and judging by their faces, no amateurs had been invited. One by one, they were called into the office. The door would open, someone would enter, and about 20 minutes later, they'd come out with an ambiguous expression, either nervous or just excellent actors. When my turn came, I stood up, feeling the others' gazes on my back, and stepped inside. 5 people sat behind a long table. In the center was a man with a steely gaze and a dark suit radiating authority. The others seemed more like props. When he spoke, they remained silent. His gaze was heavy, piercing like a blade. I immediately understood. He was the boss, the one who would decide if I got the job. The questions came rapid fire, like machine gun rounds, about my experience, skills, reasons for leaving my previous service. I answered clearly and without hesitation. If anyone was used to maintaining composure before superiors, it was me. I spoke calmly, directly, making it clear. I wasn't just qualified, I was perfect for the job. When it was all over, the boss glanced at the others. They exchanged subtle smiles, a silent agreement. I knew then it was done. The job was mine. Rising confidently, I left the room, the heavy sound of my boots echoing across the floor. In the lobby, the other candidates glanced at me, but I didn't bother meeting their eyes. I felt calm, almost celebratory. This job could be the start of something new. What exactly? I didn't know yet. The next day, I got a call. Didn't have to wait long. The voice on the line, still that same pleasant female tone, invited me for another interview. Once again, I arrived at the same building, but this time I was escorted to a different room. Inside, things were far more intriguing. The walls were covered entirely with mirrors, which immediately made my stomach tighten. With one glance, I realized these weren't ordinary mirrors. Someone was likely watching from behind them. This level of secrecy made me wonder what kind of job required such close observation of your every move. But there wasn't much time to think. I waited for instructions. After a few minutes, a man approached me. Middle-aged, wearing a gray suit, his features sharp and unforgiving. He got straight to the point, skipping any pleasantries. His questions were more detailed this time. I answered precisely, the way I'd been trained to during interrogations. No emotions, just facts. Once he finished, he handed me a test. The questions were strange, but I didn't ask. I just focused on completing the task. The man watched silently, occasionally nodding as if pleased with my answers. When I handed in the test, he left the room, saying he needed to discuss the results with his superiors. 10 minutes later, he returned, and his expression was almost approving. "You're a good fit for us," he said, and I felt a small stir of emotion inside. "But before we disclose any details, you need to sign a non-disclosure agreement. Let me be clear. This job serves state interests. If you decide to break the agreement, believe me, it won't end with a fine. The consequences will be serious and irreversible. Understood?" I nodded. This wasn't my first time working under confidentiality. "I'm used to keeping my mouth shut," I replied calmly, looking him directly in the eye. He nodded in satisfaction, pulled some papers from a folder, and handed them to me. I scanned the text quickly, checking for anything unusual. The terms were strict, as expected. Near the end of the document, a figure caught my eye, a sum that was frankly a pleasant surprise. But immediately after it was a small note about the risk to life. There it was, I thought. It all made sense. For this kind of money, the job was bound to be dangerous. Still, I signed. The man collected the papers, carefully checked each page, and left the room. When he returned, he was carrying another folder. "You'll be working as a guard in a prison," he said, watching me intently. "But this isn't an ordinary prison. All the rules are outlined in this folder. You can take it with you, but don't lose it and don't show it to anyone. Review it thoroughly before you start. Your shift begins in a week. You'll work 1 month on, 1 month off. Prepare accordingly." I nodded, took the folder, and left the room. As I walked to my car, one question kept circling in my mind. What kind of prison required its guards to study the rules in advance? At home, I sat at my table, opened the folder, and began reading. The deeper I went into the text, the tighter the knot in my stomach grew. The rules laid out in the folder were bizarre. They read like instructions for some science fiction movie, but they clearly applied to actual prisoners. For instance, before approaching certain cells, you were required to wear special glasses. These glasses were supposed to protect against something that could happen upon making eye contact with the prisoner. I briefly thought it was an absurd precaution, but a note in the rules stated, "Failure to comply will result in irreversible consequences." What those consequences might be wasn't specified. One rule addressed food delivery. In certain zones, meals had to be delivered remotely through mechanized trays. Approaching the cells in these sectors was strictly forbidden. It seemed nonsensical, but things got even stranger. For one particular prisoner, the instructions explicitly stated, "Under no circumstances are you to speak to the subject. Any attempt to engage in dialogue will result in immediate disciplinary action." Again, no explanation was provided. These strange instructions were repeated over and over with the emphasized phrase, "Compliance is mandatory. Violations will not be tolerated." I wanted to believe it was just excessive precaution or bureaucratic paranoia, but an uneasy feeling began to creep in. It all seemed far too unusual for a standard guard job. My duties were simple on paper: oversee and feed the prisoners. Yet the rules provided no details about who or what was confined in those cells. They were only referred to as subjects, objects, or by cell numbers. This vagueness was unsettling. Moreover, I was to work with a partner. Together we would patrol the so-called inner zone where, as I understood it, the cells were located. My partner would evidently be my only ally in this strange place. There was also an outer zone, a kind of additional protective layer. It was guarded by other personnel, to whom we, as inner guards, had no direct access. According to the rules, this double shell was designed to prevent any escape attempts. It seemed the facility was built with maximum isolation in mind, but for whom or what remained a mystery. I couldn't shake a nagging thought. If the prison was this secure, who were the prisoners? What had they done to warrant such extreme precautions? The idea that they might be dangerous criminals made sense, but something didn't add up. Why hire outsiders, even former military personnel, when they could use vetted professionals from intelligence or special forces? The only answer that came to mind was turnover. Perhaps the job was so dangerous that people didn't stick around for long. Turnover due to mortality, the thought flashed, sending a chill down my spine. I glanced at the schedule and the safety instructions, which emphasized the importance of following protocols, and thought, I need to be careful, very careful. The more I read, the stronger the feeling that I was stepping into something better left unknown. Time flew by quickly. After packing my things, I waited for my ride. A windowless van arrived, and I was ushered into the back. I couldn't see where we were going, but the very fact that such precautions were necessary was mildly unsettling. The drive took about 3 hours. We stopped a couple of times at roadside cafes for restroom breaks, but I was strictly forbidden from speaking to anyone. The driver simply escorted me to the restroom and back. Well, at least there's that, I thought, stretching my stiff legs. When the van finally stopped, I stepped out and saw an enormous concrete structure. It looked like a giant, featureless box, devoid of windows or any hint of civilization. Surrounding the building was a barren expanse, as if someone had deliberately cleared all the land around it. Beyond the wasteland stood a tall metal fence, topped with barbed wire, and behind it were watchtowers manned by armed guards. This was a prison, one of those that people might call impossible to escape. I was escorted inside. The first thing that greeted me was a series of security checkpoints. The procedure took about 30 minutes. Scanners, pat-downs, and a barrage of questions. Finally, I was led to a small room where they issued me a badge with my name and photo, along with a dark gray guard uniform. It was practical and well-designed, with emblems already attached to the pockets, signifying that I was part of the inner contingent. Next, I was shown to the living quarters where I'd stay during my off-duty hours. My room was much better than I'd expected, small but comfortable, with all the necessary furniture. In the center of the residential sector was a shared lounge area, something like a combined kitchen and living room, complete with a pool table and a couple of couches. As I was looking around, a man emerged from one of the bedrooms. He was about my age, in his 30s, tall with a buzz cut and a solid build that suggested he'd been through his share of challenges. A slight smirk on his face gave him an approachable air. "Hey," he said, extending a hand. "I'm Mark. Looks like we're partners now. Guess we'll have to rely on each other, so let's start off on the right foot." I shook his hand, feeling the firm grip. "I'm Alex," I replied. "Sounds like a plan." Mark nodded, and we exchanged a few more words. He struck me as a likable guy, calm, confident, and clearly aware of the situation he was in. It was reassuring, and I thought he'd make a solid partner. Afterward, I headed into the bedroom assigned to me and changed into my uniform. It fit well and looked sharp. though the sensation of being in a tightly controlled, highly regulated environment weighed on me. When I stepped out of my room, I saw Mark sitting at the kitchen table, eating leisurely from a few food packs spread out in front of him. His demeanor was relaxed, but there was a flicker of unease in his eyes, one I suspected mirrored my own. I walked over to the fridge, grabbed a glass of water, and leaned against the counter after taking a few sips. "New here too?" I asked. Mark nodded, chewing before replying. "Yeah, looks like they threw the two of us into the fire. How are we supposed to figure all this out?" I managed to nod in agreement. But before I could say anything more, the door to our quarters opened. A man walked in. He looked to be in his 40s, tall and slim, dressed in a sharp black suit that emphasized his austere presence. His hair was neatly cropped, and his cold, assessing eyes glinted behind thick-rimmed glasses. "Agent Johnson," he introduced himself curtly, pulling a couple of folders from the briefcase he carried and handing them to us. "These contain your instructions and special access badges." Mark and I stood to take the folders as Johnson continued. "This job is straightforward. Just follow the instructions. Everything you need to know about how this place operates, where you're supposed to be, and what to do is detailed here. Your shift begins tomorrow morning. Make sure you thoroughly review the materials to avoid questions." We both nodded, trying not to show any tension. Johnson cast another icy glance at us before walking out, leaving behind a weighty silence. As the door closed, I turned to Mark and asked, "Doesn't this place feel suspicious to you? Usually in a setup like this, there's at least one experienced guard to guide the newbies. But here, just the two of us. Something doesn't add up." Mark nodded thoughtfully. "Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. It's all weird. And they're hammering the importance of these instructions way too hard, like no one sticks around here for long." He fell silent as I opened my folder. The initial pages seemed dull and procedural, rules, guidelines, and floor plans. But the deeper I read, the more questions surfaced. The map highlighted zones marked high-security areas, and many instructions hinted at significant danger. The growing sense of unease gnawed at me, yet no direct explanations were given. "What do you think?" I asked Mark, looking up from my folder. He was already engrossed in his own set of documents. Without lifting his eyes, he muttered, "I think tomorrow we'll find out what we've gotten ourselves into, or wish we hadn't." I nodded silently, and we both returned to our reading. It was shaping up to be a long night with a morning that promised to be even more tense. The morning started early. I woke up to the sound of my alarm, a subtle tension settling in as I prepared for my first day at this strange facility. According to the schedule, the prison housed 10 cells, 6 of which were empty. Each prisoner had a specific feeding and visitation time, planned with near military precision. The first stop was cell 3 at 8 a.m. I got ready quickly, washing up and gearing up before stepping out of my room. Mark was already up, dressed and waiting. He looked slightly tense, and I couldn't blame him. This job was clearly not going to be simple. We ate breakfast in silence, each lost in thought about the day ahead, and then made our way to Section 95. Section 95 turned out to be a small room with a tiny window in the wall. We knocked, and after a few moments the window slid open. A tray of food was handed to us. Nothing special, just a standard meal, but its delivery was handled with excessive caution, almost sterile. Even food was treated as though any interaction carried significant risk. Next, we headed to Section 94, where the equipment was stored. The room was spacious, lined with cabinets filled with gear, protective suits, helmets, tools, and, most notably, weapons. On a separate rack were tranquilizer pistols and rifles loaded with specialized ammunition that dispersed paralyzing gas on impact. The arsenal was clearly designed for suppression rather than lethal force. We decided to work in shifts. One of us would carry the food while the other remained armed. Today it was my turn to carry the tray, so I equipped myself with a tranquilizer pistol while Mark took a gas rifle. At first glance, we seemed prepared for anything. Once we were geared up, we proceeded down the corridor. This part of the prison had an especially ominous atmosphere. A long hallway illuminated by harsh, cold light stretched before us, lined with reinforced doors. Each door was equipped with a badge scanner and looked sturdy enough to withstand nearly anything. We passed the first 2 doors, cells 1 and 2, which we knew were empty. Finally, we stopped in front of cell 3. I swiped my badge against the scanner and the door unlocked with a soft click. Inside was a small antechamber, a sort of buffer zone before the main cell. Ahead was the prisoner's chamber, separated by a thick set of bars. The cell itself was surprisingly well equipped, resembling a high-end prison suite. It had a bed, a table, a toilet, and even a television. A gaming console hung on the wall, and a treadmill stood in the corner. Luxury for inmates, I thought, though the lack of windows and any way out seemed like torture in itself. I placed the food tray into a designated slot for meal delivery. The inmate inside slowly rose. He was bald, with sharp, angular features and a peculiar way of moving. Deliberate, almost analytical, as if studying our every action. As he approached, I noticed something deeply unsettling: his eyes. They were unnaturally large and disproportionate, with pupils that spun like spirals, slowly rotating as if attempting to draw us in. A chill ran down my spine. This wasn't human. My brain struggled to process what I was seeing. "So, we have fresh faces," he said, his voice deep and resonant, almost vibrating. He moved closer to the food slot, but upon noticing our protective glasses, he stopped. It seemed he realized his attempts at whatever effect he intended would be useless. With a hint of irritation, he grabbed the tray, carried it to his table, and began eating. Mark and I stood silently, the tension between us palpable. At that moment, I understood why the glasses were mandatory, and I realized this place was far from any ordinary prison. We waited while the prisoner from cell number 3 finished his meal, exchanging uneasy glances with Mark. A heavy sense of foreboding weighed on us both. This was no ordinary person. His eyes could drive someone insane, and we had no idea what might have happened to us without the protective goggles. When he returned the tray, his gaze locked on us again. "Don't you want to look me straight in the eyes?" he asked with a crooked smirk. I didn't reply. I quickly grabbed the tray and slid it into the transport slot. We hurried out of the cell without looking back. Returning to Section 94, we placed the dirty dishes into the special disposal unit. It was 8:30, and we had to prepare food for the next cell. Cell number 4 was empty, so next up was cell number 5. This time, the procedure was different. We had to wear protective suits. We approached the lockers, pulling on the bulky outfits with sealed helmets and integrated air filters. I felt the internal ventilation system activate, isolating us from the outside environment. Mark picked up a stun gas weapon, and I armed myself again with a tranquilizer pistol. Carrying the food, we moved down the corridor as before. Swiping our pass card, we opened the door to cell number 5. Behind it was an antechamber with double doors. As the first door sealed behind us, a sterilizing gas sprayed out, engulfing us. It was unpleasant but bearable. Once the process finished, the second door unlocked, and we stepped inside. The room was dimly lit, filled with a dense, fog-like gas that seemed almost alive, swirling around us. The only light came from the bright ceiling lamp struggling to penetrate the haze. I approached the food slot, set the tray down, and called out loudly, "Food is ready!" We waited, but no one emerged from the fog. I started to feel uneasy. "Hey, hurry up!" I shouted. There was no response. Mark and I exchanged nervous looks, unsure of what to do. I stepped forward and raised my voice. "If you don't want to eat, we're leaving." Suddenly, a hand shot out of the fog, gripping the food slot's grill and yanking it. The hand was grotesque, covered in festering sores oozing some kind of liquid. It seemed as though the gas itself seeped out from the wounds. Following the hand, the prisoner slowly emerged from the mist. He was dressed in a prison jumpsuit with the number 5 emblazoned on the chest. His body was covered in pulsating sores and ulcers, each exuding the same milky gas that filled the room. A shiver ran down my spine. This was no human. It was something else entirely. My instinct screamed at me to leave immediately. The prisoner stared at us silently, his face devoid of expression. Then he grabbed the tray and disappeared back into the fog. We stood there, waiting for him to return the dishes, but the minutes ticked by with no sign of him. We exchanged worried glances, debating our next move. I remembered we had a special bomb that could incapacitate the prisoner, and there was a button on the wall to purge the room of gas. "We have ways to make you come out," I said. Apparently that got through. After a few moments, the prisoner reappeared, approached the slot, and returned the tray. We quickly grabbed it and left the cell, not lingering for even a second longer. Back in Section 94, I felt the weight of dread starting to lift. We removed our protective suits, and Mark exhaled nervously. "Damn, I wasn't expecting that. I thought we'd be dealing with criminals, but these are monsters, Alex. Do you get that?" I nodded, feeling equally shaken. "I do, but we don't have time to think about it now. We need to follow protocol. That's what we're paid for." My words seemed to ground Mark. He looked at me and nodded. "You're right. We just do our job." We sat down on the couch waiting for the next shift. The clock approached 9 o'clock, and I knew that with each new cell, the situation would only get worse. At 8:55, we prepared to visit Cell 8. This time, there was almost no protective gear, just special mouth guards we had to wear. These were meant to prevent us from accidentally speaking. The rule for the 8th prisoner was clear. Under no circumstances should you speak to him. The mouth guard made it difficult to talk or even make sounds, but by now, I wasn't surprised by such peculiar precautions. After the encounters with the previous prisoners, it seemed every rule here had its reasons. Even if those reasons weren't immediately clear, my military training had taught me to adapt quickly, even to situations my mind refused to accept as reality. "I'll think about it later," I told myself as we pushed the food cart down the long corridor towards Cell 8. This was the penultimate prisoner, and the tension was palpable. When we reached the door, I scanned my pass. The door opened slowly, and we stepped inside. At first glance, the cell looked standard, but closer inspection revealed unsettling details. The bars here were much thicker and reinforced. Strange symbols adorned the walls, shamanic drawings or ancient protective runes. They're holding something far more than just a person here, I thought. We pushed the cart to the food slot and placed the tray inside. I knocked on the bars to get the prisoner's attention. A figure lay on the bed under a thin blanket. I knocked again, and after a few seconds he stirred. A man appeared, looking to be around 50 years old. His appearance was haggard. A gaunt face, dull eyes, and unshaven stubble. He wore a bright orange prison jumpsuit. This made me wonder. Each prisoner seemed to have a unique color-coded uniform. Could the colors signify their danger level? If so, what did orange mean? The man approached the bars and began speaking. His voice was surprisingly gentle, unhurried, almost friendly. Every word sounded like he had been waiting a long time to talk to someone. He seemed harmless, and his speech was oddly soothing, like a lullaby. There was a distinct urge to respond, but the mouthguard kept us silent. I knocked on the bars again, pointing to the food tray to indicate we weren't here for conversation. The man fell silent, but disappointment flashed in his eyes. He took the tray, set it on the table, and began to eat. We stood silently, following the instructions. When he finished, he returned the empty dishes to the slot. As we prepared to leave, he spoke again. His voice felt like it was burrowing into my mind, comforting and relaxing. If it were truly dangerous, I thought, we wouldn't even be allowed to hear him. But resisting its influence seemed possible. A pleasant voice, I thought briefly before dismissing the notion. We had no idea what he was capable of, and it wasn't worth the risk. As we turned to leave, he gave us one last look, full of sorrow. That look lingered with me even after we returned to Section 94. We placed the dishes into the disposal unit and sat down to wait for 10 o'clock. Mark broke the silence first. That guy, he was strange. Didn't it seem like you could trust him? Like you could have a normal conversation with him? I nodded, but replied cautiously. Maybe that's his trick. He acts that way to disarm us. We need to stay alert. Mark sighed heavily but agreed. Yeah, you're right. We just stick to the job, nothing more. We stayed seated, waiting for the next shift. But the tension from this encounter lingered. It felt like each prisoner added another layer of mystery to this place. And with every step forward, the atmosphere grew darker and more unnerving. When the time came to visit the final prisoner in cell 10, an uneasy tension settled over me. This wasn't like the other cells. The records contained no specific restrictions or warnings, only a single instruction. Treat him with respect. I didn't know what that meant, but I decided to follow the rules. As before, Mark and I armed ourselves. I carried the tranquilizer pistol while Mark held the gas weapon. We wheeled the cart down the corridor, bracing ourselves for anything. But what we encountered was nothing I could have expected. When we arrived at the door to cell 10, I noticed it wasn't reinforced like the others. There were no armored locks or scanners, just an ordinary door with a handle. The record stated that we should knock before entering. What nonsense is this? I thought, but I knew better than to break protocol here. I knocked. A voice responded from the other side. Just a moment, I'll be right there. Mark and I exchanged bewildered glances, waiting for what would happen next. The door opened, and a man in his early 40s stood before us. He looked neat, almost welcoming. Short-cropped hair, clean-shaven face, thin-framed glasses, and a calm smile. He wore a red jumpsuit marked with the number 10. "Come in," he said, stepping aside and gesturing for us to enter. "I don't like eating alone. Join me." I nodded, though every instinct screamed that this was wrong. Mark and I pushed the cart inside, cautiously scanning our surroundings. The room was more like a hotel suite than a prison cell. Comfortable furniture, a television, shelves lined with books, and a neatly made bed. A soft rug covered the floor, and in the corner stood a small table already set with a coffee service. This is a prisoner? I thought, struggling to process the scene. Questions swirled in my mind. Why was he allowed to move freely? Why were there no security measures? The man took the tray from the cart, carefully arranged the food on the table, and gestured toward 2 chairs. "Please sit. You can wait here while I eat." We sat, keeping our weapons ready. His red jumpsuit with the number 10 stood out starkly, sparking a thought. The most dangerous inmate in this prison? The layout of the cells wasn't sequential, and I wondered if the numbers and uniform colors represented some kind of classification system. If so, red likely meant the highest level of threat. The man calmly arranged his meal, moving with an unsettling grace. Before sitting down, he stood, washed his hands meticulously, and returned to the table. He nodded to us politely and said, "Thank you for the meal." He ate slowly, with an almost aristocratic poise. We watched in silence, on edge. When he finished, he neatly placed the empty dishes aside, picked up his coffee, and turned to us. "So, how's your first day?" he asked, sipping his drink. His voice was soft but carried an undeniable authority. "I imagine this place has surprised you quite a bit." The prisoner's words made me uneasy. At first, it was just a casual question. It seemed like he merely wanted to chat. But now he was openly sharing things that made my hair stand on end. Still, I didn't want to come across as rude or show my fear, so I kept calm and replied, "Yeah, this place is strange, and the creatures here, they're strange too." The man chuckled and with a slight smirk said, "That's just how this organization operates. They take rookies, explain nothing, and throw them into this hell. Let me tell you, it's quite dangerous here. The last 2 guards, they didn't make it." A chill ran down my spine. Mark and I exchanged glances, our eyes asking the same unspoken question. "What does he mean?" The man, clearly enjoying the effect of his words, continued, "Yeah, they worked here for a couple of months, got used to the prisoners. That was their biggest mistake. Remember this. Never let your guard down. The rules aren't just for show, they'll save your life. Those 2 forgot that, despite my warnings. For some reason, they didn't like me. Trusted the guy in cell 8 more. You've met him, haven't you?" We nodded, not wanting to interrupt him unnecessarily. "You've probably noticed how he talks. It's not hypnotic, it's not his eyes or his voice. It's something else. He has a way of earning your trust. At first you're just listening. Then you start to like him. You want to talk to him more. And that's when it's all over." Mark, clearly unable to hold back any longer, asked the question that was on both our minds. "And what happens if you break that rule?" The man lifted his gaze, his calm demeanor suddenly unnerving. He slowly sipped from his coffee before answering. "You lose all your memories. I suspect it's because through conversation he can drain his victims' souls. You become an empty, soulless puppet under his control. The last time it happened, things got so out of hand that the guards had to be shot. They attacked other staff completely out of their minds. That's the kind of creature he is. People call him Doppler. Basically, it's a being that takes on human form, but its true nature is more like a slug." Mark tensed up, his fists clenching tightly. My own thoughts were spiraling. Damn, these really are monsters. Now, as I looked at the man across from me, I couldn't help but think, what kind of monster is sitting in front of me? His red jumpsuit and the number 10 meant something significant. He clearly knew more than the other prisoners, and judging by his demeanor, wasn't just informed. He knew how to use that knowledge. Suddenly, Mark asked another question. "Why do they hire people like us? And who are you anyway?" The man looked at us as if wondering why we'd ask such an obvious question and replied, "It's simple. Neither of you has close family or anyone who would worry about you, right?" Mark and I nodded involuntarily, though the truth of it brought a faint twinge of regret. "Well then," he continued, "if you die here, no one's going to ask too many questions. And there's a high turnover rate here. They can't afford to lose their experienced staff, nor do they need to. That's the harsh reality. That's also why they pay you so well." Makes sense, I thought. I'd already suspected as much. The situation was clear. We were expendable. But what could I do? The decision had already been made. The man fell silent, as if he had nothing more to say. I took the opportunity to ask the question that had been gnawing at me. Who are you, and why are you free to move around here so easily? He took another sip of his coffee, his gaze briefly clouded as though recalling something distant. Then, with a faint smile, he said, "Ah, yes, I haven't introduced myself. They call me Edgar." We introduced ourselves in turn. He simply nodded as if committing our names to memory. "Who am I?" he continued, leaning back in his chair. "I'm as dangerous as the creatures kept in this prison. Why do I have such freedom? Simple. I put myself here." His words struck a chord. Put himself here? I thought. Who voluntarily imprisons themselves in a place like this? Edgar seemed to read my mind. He didn't elaborate, just smirked and glanced at the clock. "Time's up. You better go. It was nice chatting with you. See you tomorrow." We nodded silently. Gathering the dishes onto the cart, we pushed it back down the hall, our minds racing with 1,000 questions. By the time we returned to Section 94 and removed our gear, the feeling was surreal. On the one hand, we were beginning to understand the kind of place we'd ended up in. On the other, we still didn't know the full truth. After changing, we went back to our rooms. Our work for the day was done. Oddly enough, nothing more was expected of us. We didn't have access to the surveillance cameras I'd noticed scattered throughout the prison. We didn't monitor the inmates or perform any active security duties. We were here for one thing: to feed them. We're like those workers sent to an emergency nuclear reactor, I thought, staring at the ceiling in my room. Doomed with a single task: get to the site, absorb a fatal dose of radiation, and complete the mission. That summed up our job. Simple, yet costly. But there was one clause in our contract that remained a mystery to me. Occasionally, we were required to participate in something called Mission 895. What that entailed was never explained. The only reminder of it was the red light on the wall of our room. If it turned on, we had to be ready. I didn't know what the mission was, but one thing was certain. If that red light ever flashed, the day would be far more harrowing than simply feeding prisoners. So our days went by. Each morning we followed our usual routine, feeding the inmates, inspecting their condition, and ensuring they adhered to the rules. Afterward, we had free time. We were allowed to take walks in a designated area around the prison. The walks were supervised, but we could enjoy the sunshine and momentarily escape the oppressive atmosphere inside. We made it a point to minimize contact with the prisoners, especially after learning more about their abilities. The only exception was Edgar. We often spoke with him. He was talkative and seemed to know a great deal about the beings confined in this place. One day, during one of these conversations, Edgar, sipping his customary coffee, brought up the inmate in cell number 3. "That creature is called the Spiral," Edgar began, his tone becoming slightly more serious. "No one knows for sure where it came from, but there's a theory it originated in South America. Its true nature isn't physical at all. It's more like the embodiment of an idea than a real animal." I listened intently, feeling a flood of questions forming in my mind. "How did it end up here?" Mark asked, unable to contain his curiosity. Edgar smiled faintly, though there was a grim undertone to it. "That's a complicated question. Beings like that usually emerge in places where people are going through particularly hard times. In the 1970s, for example, remember the economic crisis, political instability, wars. That's when the Spiral began to appear. It would lure people into dream worlds, creating illusions they couldn't resist. Those people didn't even realize they were its victims. They thought they'd found solace, but in reality, it was feeding on their energy. People probably didn't mind, though, I ventured. But Edgar shook his head. At first, yes, but eventually it spiraled out of control. It got to the point where the FBI found it in one location, a massive warehouse with 1,000 people inside. They were sitting there like statues, completely consumed by their illusions. They believed they were living perfect lives, but their bodies were slowly dying from dehydration and starvation. Those words sent a shiver down my spine. 1,000 people, like dolls, in a single space. It was hard to fathom. Since then, the spiral has been confined here, Edgar continued, taking another sip of coffee. How long has it lived? Who knows? Probably longer than we can imagine. And how old is this place? I asked, unable to hold back. Quite old, he replied, raising an eyebrow. Ever since the government decided not to destroy such beings, but to study them instead. That's the only reason they're kept here and not eradicated. So they keep these creatures just to experiment on them, I thought as I listened to Edgar. The thought was both horrifying and, in a twisted way, logical. Suddenly Mark asked, "What about the creature in cell 5? What is that thing?" Edgar sighed, as if preparing to explain something self-evident. "That's the swamp thing. These creatures are nearly extinct. They used to dwell in swamps, but this one somehow made its way into a city and caused absolute chaos. Do you remember the gas incident 5 years ago, when 300 people died?" The memory hit me instantly. It was a national scandal back then. People died from an unknown toxic gas, and the blame fell on terrorists. Everyone spoke of a chemical attack. But it was this creature, I realized, a cold shiver running down my spine. We talked for a while longer, but the thought of these creatures lingered in my mind even after we returned to our rooms. The next day, everything changed. It began as usual. We went through our rounds, checking on cells 3 and 5, feeding the inmates and ensuring everything was in order. Then we headed to cell 8. The prisoner in cell 8 once again tried to talk to us. His voice was soft, soothing, almost melodic. But armed with Edgar's warnings, we made a conscious effort to ignore him. Then something shifted. His tone became irritated, and suddenly he seemed to snap. The prisoner began thrashing about, slamming against the bars with a deafening clang. He overturned furniture, smashing everything in sight. His body started to convulse in a grotesque, unnatural way. Before our eyes, his human form began to unravel. His skin paled and split open, thick black slime pouring out of the cracks. His arms stretched unnaturally, fingers morphing into long, twisted claws. His legs contorted grotesquely, while his body swelled, inflating as though filled with liquid. His face vanished entirely, replaced by a smooth, featureless surface that sprouted writhing, slimy tentacles. The floor of the cell became coated in glistening black ooze, emitting a suffocating stench. At that moment, the symbols etched into the walls of the cell began to glow with a brilliant blue light. The creature let out a piercing scream, an otherworldly cry of pain and fury. The glowing runes seemed to hold it back, forcing it to retreat, but it continued thrashing violently within the cell. Suddenly, alarms blared, and the corridor was bathed in flashing red light. Heavy footsteps echoed as a squad of heavily armed personnel stormed into the cell block. Dressed in black, skin-tight suits with helmets and gas masks obscuring their faces, they carried weapons clearly designed for dealing with such entities. The armed team opened fire on the creature. Their weapons released rounds that exploded into clouds of thick green gas upon impact. The cell filled with the gas, and the creature's screams grew louder. It flailed wildly, its tentacles slamming against the walls, but its movements began to slow. Gradually, it weakened, the thrashing subsiding until it lay motionless. Its monstrous form began to shrink, the black ooze retracting back into its body. Within minutes, the creature had reverted to its human form, a man lying on the floor, battered but alive. Another team, clad in white protective suits, entered the cell. They started collecting samples of the black slime, scanning the glowing symbols, and checking the prisoner's vitals. Once the cell was cleaned and restored, they gathered their equipment and left, locking the door behind them. The next day, something happened that Mark and I had subconsciously anticipated yet were completely unprepared for. The red light indicating Mission 895 flashed with a bright, alarming glow. We jumped to our feet, our hearts pounding faster. This was our signal. Quickly gathering ourselves, we headed to Section 94, where we began suiting up in protective gear. The heavy airtight equipment, equipped with filtration and defense systems, fit snugly around our bodies. We armed ourselves. I grabbed a tranquilizer pistol, while Mark opted for a gas-powered rifle. Once ready, we proceeded to the site of the call. When we arrived at Chamber 8, we saw a group of people already gathered outside. They were dressed in protective suits similar to ours, but more reinforced, with thick helmets and additional armored plates. They were all armed. Some held weapons capable of launching gas grenades, while others carried tasers designed for large creatures. "What's happening?" I asked quietly, but none of the staff paid us any attention. They were entirely focused on the chamber. Soon the team leader gave the signal, and the chamber door began to open. A heavy metallic clang echoed through the corridor. Inside there was still a thick layer of slime and a nauseating stench. As soon as the door cracked open, a tentacle lashed out, but the symbols on the walls flared brightly, weakening it. "Fire!" A loud command rang out, and the armed team began shooting. Gas grenades exploded inside the chamber, filling it with clouds of green smoke. Tasers struck the creature, causing it to convulse and emit terrifying, low-pitched roars. It began transforming into its monstrous form again. Slime dripped from its body, and its tentacles writhed, trying to reach those outside. But after a few minutes of intense fire, it fell silent. The creature's body collapsed onto the floor of the chamber, motionless. A cart, encased in reinforced glass, was wheeled to the chamber. Workers in hazmat suits quickly restrained the creature with special straps and loaded it inside. We were signaled to follow them. We escorted the cart through the corridors, past closed doors, and through several airlocks. Everywhere we went, we were met with sterile white walls and harsh, almost painful lighting. Finally, we arrived at the laboratory. The lab was a massive room filled with intricate equipment that seemed designed for research beyond the scope of human comprehension. The creature was transferred to a large table equipped with restraints and security systems. Straps tightened around its body, rendering it completely immobile. Scientists in white hazmat suits entered the laboratory. They were fully covered, their faces obscured by layers of protection. They began attaching devices to the creature, checking its vital signs, and collecting slime samples. One of them issued a brief order. "Remove the security team. They're no longer needed here." We were instructed to leave the room and return to our quarters. I couldn't shake the images of what I had seen. What are they doing with that creature? What experiments? And why? The creature wasn't returned to its chamber for several days, and during that time, the sense of unease about the secrets of this place only deepened. A few days later, the red light flashed again, and we were called back. This time we escorted the cart again, but the creature inside seemed weaker. It appeared smaller, its slime no longer oozing, and its tentacles looked shriveled. It didn't even resist. When we returned to Chamber 8, the creature was carefully placed back inside. The symbols on the walls had been updated, seeming even more complex and powerful. The chamber itself had been modified, narrowed and reinforced with additional grates. The creature simply sat on the floor and froze, as if it knew that any resistance was futile. Back in Section 94, after we had removed our protective suits, Mark finally broke the silence. "They've done something to it. It's not the same as before. Do you think it's less dangerous now?" I pondered but didn't respond. We were becoming increasingly aware that our presence here was just a small part of a much larger, darker picture. Mission 895 left a bitter aftertaste, and with each passing day, it became clearer. This wasn't just a prison. It was a place where monsters weren't just contained, but exploited for something far more terrifying. The evening was far from peaceful. The red light flashed again, flooding the room with its ominous glow. Mark and I quickly armed ourselves and donned our protective gear, fully aware that this meant trouble. Wasting no time, we hurried toward the containment sectors where the prisoners were held. When we arrived, the atmosphere was electric with tension. The corridor was packed with far more security personnel than usual, all heavily armed. Their unease was contagious. No one spoke, but it was clear that something serious was about to happen. Soon, the doors to an adjacent sector swung open, and a new prisoner was brought in. He was a massive man, towering above everyone with a hulking, almost intimidating frame. His movements were slow, as if he was resisting some unseen force. Leading him was a person in a white protective suit, holding something that resembled a scarecrow or an idol. I couldn't discern its purpose, but the object seemed to carry some symbolic weight. The man appeared to be fixated on the idol. His gaze was locked onto it. Each step he took was deliberate, as if he was holding back an immense rage. I noticed even the seasoned guards were on edge. Their fingers trembled on their triggers, and their eyes never left the prisoner. He was dressed in a dark orange robe, which immediately raised questions. Why not red? Does this signify a special level of danger? The thought crossed my mind. He was escorted to Chamber 9. This chamber was different. Strange talismans and symbols had already been placed inside. The talismans appeared handcrafted, their shapes irregular, yet they were arranged all around the perimeter of the room. The scarecrow-like object was positioned in the center of the chamber. As soon as he was secured, the guards let out a collective sigh of relief, but remained on high alert. Even after the doors closed, everyone dispersed slowly, still wary of the situation. When we returned to Section 94, Agent Johnson was waiting for us. He was as calm as ever, but there was an unmistakable tension in his tone. "Here," he said, handing us a folder. "These are new directives regarding the new prisoner. His name, well, it doesn't matter. I'll tell you this much. He's extraordinarily dangerous. Exercise extreme caution. One wrong move, and you won't see the morning." When Johnson left, we opened the folder and began reading the protocols regarding the prisoner in Chamber 9. The instructions surprised us. Unusual, even bizarre. Instead of feeding the prisoner, we were required to recite a spell from a book stored in his chamber. The rules emphasized that the reading must never be interrupted under any circumstances. An interruption could lead to severe consequences. It sounded absurd, but by now we understood that every rule here existed for a reason. The next day, after completing the rounds of the first 3 chambers, we made our way to the 9th. Saying we were nervous would be an understatement. We walked slowly, trying to steel ourselves, but the feeling of unease only grew stronger. When we reached the chamber, I swiped my pass, and the door unlocked with a heavy click. We stepped inside. The chamber was ordinary at first glance. The walls were adorned with strange talismans and symbols, clearly meant for containment. In the center of the room stood the same scarecrow-like effigy we had seen before, as if it served as a ward. In the corner, on a shelf, rested a large worn book with metallic edges. The prisoner himself was in the far corner of the chamber. A massive man, his hulking frame seemed too large for the space. He stood motionless, leaning against the wall, staring at us. His eyes, filled with malice, hatred, and something even more terrifying, pierced through me. It felt as though he wasn't just seeing us, but also our fears. I forced myself to approach the shelf and pick up the book. It was heavy, its cover engraved with strange symbols. When I opened it, I saw pages filled with unfamiliar script. There were eerie, ominous illustrations, figures with distorted faces, scenes of destruction and chaos. However, above the strange writing, there were carefully printed English transcriptions meant to be read aloud. "Mark, are you ready?" I asked, noticing his nervousness. His hands were trembling slightly as he nodded. "You start. I need a moment to gather myself." I nodded, trying to maintain my composure. The book felt alive in my hands, its pages radiating a faint warmth, almost pulsing. Before starting, I glanced again at the creature. Its stare had grown even more menacing. It took a step forward, and I instinctively stepped back but reminded myself that we were armed and had the effigy, which supposedly kept it at bay. Taking a deep breath, I opened to the first page and began reading. The words came out slowly, deliberately. They were strange and foreign, but the transcription allowed me to pronounce them correctly. My voice was steady, though I could feel a tremor in my body. The creature began to move. It was no longer still. Step by step, it paced the chamber like a caged animal. Its eyes were locked on me. The further I read, the more agitated it became. Its movements turned abrupt and chaotic. It began to growl, a deep, guttural sound that seemed to rise from the depths of the earth. At one point, it approached the bars, grabbing them with its enormous hands and shaking them violently. The metal groaned but held firm. Following protocol, Mark moved the effigy closer to the bars. The creature immediately recoiled, howling and retreating. But its rage only grew. It began thrashing about the chamber, destroying everything in its path. Furniture splintered, shelves collapsed, and the symbols on the walls glowed faintly, containing its attempts to charge at us. I tried to ignore the chaos, keeping my eyes fixed on the page. I read without stopping, even as sweat trickled down my face. The creature roared, lunged, and smashed anything it could reach. Finally, I finished the first act. The last words felt heavy, as though the book was draining me. I closed it, exhaled deeply, and stepped back. "Half-hour break," I said, feeling the tension slowly release its grip. Mark nodded silently, still gripping his weapon tightly. We both understood this was just the beginning. We decided to step into the corridor to take a breather. Reading from the book was far more exhausting than I had anticipated. I wiped the sweat from my face, feeling the tension slowly fade with each step. Mark walked beside me, but I noticed his hands trembling and his gaze distant, as if he wasn't entirely present. "Are you okay? Will you manage?" I asked, looking him directly in the eyes. Mark clenched his fists as if summoning all his resolve and finally replied, "Yeah, I'll try." I nodded. This place had a way of undermining even the most seasoned professionals. But there wasn't much time for reflection. The break flew by quickly, and we returned to the chamber. This time, it was Mark's turn to read from the book. He opened it, his fingers trembling slightly. I saw his eyes repeatedly flicker toward the creature, which stood motionless in the corner, watching us with its hateful, menacing stare. As soon as Mark began to read, the creature immediately grew restless. It started moving, growling and pacing from one corner to another. Within minutes, its anger began to escalate. It lunged at the walls and tried to rip down the shelves. The talismans and the effigy in the center of the chamber glowed faintly, restraining it, but the tension in the air was palpable. I began to worry the cage wouldn't hold. The creature kept thrashing, destroying everything in its path. Furniture splintered, and the symbols on the walls flared brighter. Mark continued reading, but I could hear his voice faltering. His hands were shaking more, and he started stumbling over the words. The creature howled as if sensing Mark's weakness. Its roar grew louder, almost deafening. The room was in ruins. Nothing was left intact. And then Mark stumbled. He stopped reading, cursed, and tried to pick up where he left off. But it was too late. That brief pause was enough for everything to spiral out of control. The creature let out a piercing roar that struck like a physical blow, forcing me to step back. Its body began to transform rapidly. Its skin darkened and became covered in matted, tangled fur. Its arms elongated, ending in massive clawed hands. Two enormous twisted antlers, like those of a stag, sprouted from its head. Its face contorted into a grotesque, snarling maw with glowing red eyes and jagged teeth. Before us stood something I had only ever read about in myths, something I never imagined I would see in reality. A wendigo. It roared again, a bone-chilling sound that made my chest tighten. It lunged at the bars, gripping them with its massive claws. The metal groaned under the pressure, but held, barely. Mark had stopped reading entirely. He was frozen, paralyzed by terror. The corridor filled with the wailing of the alarm, bathing the area in red light. But the wendigo was no longer contained by any barriers. With a feral snarl, it yanked on the bars, and they screeched as they ripped free from their anchors, crashing onto the floor with a heavy thud. "Fire!" I shouted, and we opened fire. Gas grenades detonated, filling the room with choking clouds, but the creature seemed unaffected. It moved through the smoke, snarling and charging at us. "Mark, move!" I grabbed his arm, pulling him out of his stupor, and we bolted for the exit. The wendigo charged after us, its claws scraping against the walls, its roars echoing down the corridors. My heart thundered in my chest, but I didn't dare look back. As Mark and I slammed the reinforced door shut behind us, the metallic clang echoed in our ears. Inside, the wendigo roared, striking the door with such force that dents began forming almost immediately, as if the heavy steel were mere foil. A squad of about 10 guards flooded into the corridor, all armed to the teeth. One of them was holding the same scarecrow-like effigy we'd seen before, its supposed purpose to contain the creature. We stepped back, taking position behind the guards, but the rising tension in the air was almost suffocating. Then, with a deafening crash, the chamber door exploded outward. The mangled steel slammed into the opposite wall, leaving a massive dent. In the doorway, the wendigo emerged. It stepped forward slowly, its glowing red eyes scanning each of us, as if deciding who to attack first. Its claws scraped against the floor, leaving gouges in the metal, and its enormous twisted antlers nearly brushed the ceiling. The guard holding the effigy advanced cautiously, attempting to use it to pacify the creature. For a brief moment, the wendigo paused, its gaze fixed on the effigy. but then it unleashed a piercing, beastly roar. Before the guard could react, the wendigo grabbed the dislodged door and hurled it with terrifying strength. The door struck the man with the effigy, sending him flying into the wall. He collapsed in a heap, unconscious. The wendigo immediately lunged at the remaining guards. Its movements were unnaturally fast, defying the laws of physics. The guards opened fire, this time using heavy armor-piercing rounds instead of gas projectiles. Bullets tore into its flesh, but the creature didn't falter. If anything, the pain only seemed to enrage it further. With a guttural roar, the wendigo seized a nearby guard and hurled him across the corridor. His body hit the wall with a sickening thud, leaving a bloody smear as he slid down. Another guard was impaled on its antlers, lifted off the ground, and flung aside like a rag doll. Blood was everywhere, splattered on the walls, pooling on the floor, and coating the guards themselves. Their screams reverberated through the corridor, amplifying the sense of despair. We both opened fire with our weapons. The wendigo, however, was unstoppable. It seemed to revel in its fury, tearing through anything and anyone in its path. I thought it was the end. Nothing seemed capable of stopping it. Then, with a low, resonant creak, the door to Chamber 10 opened. From the shadows stepped Edgar, his demeanor eerily calm. His piercing gaze locked onto the wendigo, and to my astonishment, the creature immediately sensed his presence. It froze mid-rampage, halting its destruction. Slowly, its head turned to face Edgar, and the blazing, deranged light in its eyes burned even brighter. The wendigo let out a deep, guttural growl, lowering its massive antlers toward Edgar. It was clear the creature saw him as a true adversary. Edgar, however, didn't flinch. He stood his ground, his expression cold and unyielding. "Well then," Edgar said quietly, his voice carrying an unsettling authority that echoed through the corridor. "Go ahead, try me." The wendigo charged at Edgar with a fury so intense it seemed to tear through the air itself. Its massive body moved with blinding speed, its twisted antlers aimed squarely at his chest. But Edgar didn't flinch. As the wendigo came within a step of him, he sidestepped with effortless precision, as if performing a graceful dance. The creature crashed into the wall with a thunderous impact, cracking it, but immediately spun around, releasing a guttural roar of frustration. Edgar remained calm, his piercing gaze locked onto the wendigo as it prepared for another attack. Then, something began to change. At first it was subtle, a faint tremor in Edgar's body, but it quickly grew stronger, as though a dormant force within him was awakening. It took me a moment to realize what was happening. Edgar's hands began to transform. Thick, gray-black fur sprouted across his skin, his fingers lengthening into dagger-like claws. His face twisted grotesquely, his jaw extending into a snout filled with sharp, elongated teeth. His eyes burned a fierce predatory yellow. His back arched as his muscles swelled and his claws scraped deep grooves into the metal floor. Edgar was no longer human. Standing before us was a massive werewolf equal in size to the wendigo. His powerful frame radiated raw, primal energy, and the deep growl that escaped his throat was a chilling warning no one could ignore. The wendigo, recognizing an equal adversary, howled and lunged at Edgar with renewed ferocity. They collided with a resounding crash that echoed throughout the corridor. Their claws tore at each other's flesh, their savage strength shaking the walls. The wendigo tried to impale Edgar with its antlers, but Edgar grabbed them firmly, holding the creature at bay. Their struggle was like that of ancient titans locked in a battle for dominance. With a ferocious roar, Edgar hurled the wendigo aside, slamming it into the wall. But the creature quickly rose, charging at him again. The corridor shook with each blow they exchanged. The walls cracked and the floor buckled under their combined weight. The wendigo slashed at Edgar with its claws, but he dodged with beast-like agility and retaliated, driving his own claws deep into the creature's side. A thick black ichor spilled from the wound. Then, in one swift, decisive motion, Edgar grabbed the wendigo by the head. His claws sank into the creature's skull, and I heard the sickening crunch of bone. The wendigo howled in agony, thrashing to break free, but Edgar's grip only tightened. With an incredible burst of strength, he lifted the wendigo into the air and, with a horrifying crack, tore its head from its body. The severed head dangled in Edgar's massive, clawed hand, while the wendigo's lifeless body collapsed to the floor in a pool of thick black blood. Edgar stood in the center of the corridor, the predator victorious, his glowing yellow eyes scanning us with a cold, calculating intensity. Mark and I were frozen in place, unable to move. My heart pounded wildly in my chest as my eyes remained fixed on the gruesome scene before me. Edgar, the werewolf, dropped the wendigo's head onto the floor with a heavy thud. Black blood still dripped from it, pooling around his feet. Without a word, Edgar turned and began walking back to his chamber. His heavy footsteps echoed through the now silent corridor. As he reached his room, the door to Chamber 10 shut behind him with a final, ominous clang. Mark and I remained standing, staring at the wendigo's lifeless body, unable to process what had just unfolded. The echo of monstrous roars still lingered in the air, but one thing was clear. Edgar wasn't just a creature. He was the apex predator in a world of monsters. Soon, more guards arrived in the corridor. They efficiently secured the area, began evacuating the wounded, and swiftly restored order. The injured were taken to medical facilities, while the bodies of the fallen guards were respectfully removed. It was a well-practiced operation, as if the facility was used to handling such catastrophic events. Mark and I returned to Section 94 in silence, each of us processing what had just happened. Once the chaos had subsided, Agent Johnson came to see us. His stern gaze was as unyielding as ever, but this time there was a tension in his voice that hadn't been there before. "What the hell happened?" he demanded, directing his question at Mark. Mark briefly recounted how he had stumbled during the recitation, triggering the wendigo's transformation. Johnson listened intently, without interrupting, and then issued Mark a formal reprimand. I glanced at Mark, half expecting him to throw in the towel and walk away after such a scolding. But his expression was resolute. He said nothing, but his determined eyes made it clear. He wasn't giving up. Perhaps he saw this as a lesson, a painful but necessary step toward becoming stronger. I couldn't help but respect him for that. "Get back to work tomorrow," Johnson continued, his tone calmer now. "For now, take the rest of the day off. You need to recover." We nodded silently, and Johnson left, leaving the two of us alone. I considered saying something, but decided against it. Mark needed time to process the events on his own. The next day, we returned to our duties. The corridor where the wendigo's body had lain just the night before was unrecognizable. The walls had been repaired, the floor cleaned, and there were no traces of the blood or destruction that had painted the scene so vividly in my memory. It was as if the entire ordeal had been a nightmare, nothing more than a fleeting hallucination. We resumed our usual rounds of the chambers. Work carried on as if nothing had happened. Yet, a lingering thought gnawed at the back of my mind. What else will they bring here? This prison felt like a bottomless abyss, filled with secrets and horrors I could only begin to comprehend. Though I had no idea what kind of monster might arrive next, one thing was clear. Every day here was a test of our endurance and our sanity.